It's my great pleasure to introduce today's seminar speaker, Dr. Fushcia Hoover from UNC Charlotte, where she is an assistant professor in the Department of Geography and Earth Sciences. She held a PhD in interdisciplinary ecological sciences and engineering, agricultural biological engineering from Purdue University. Before joining the faculty at UNC Charlotte, she was a postdoctoral researcher with Dissecting, and she also was with the Environmental Protection Agency in Cincinnati, and also a postdoctoral affiliate at Arizona State University with the Julie Ann Wrigley Global Institute of Sustainability. Dr. Hoover works at the intersection of green infrastructure, environmental justice, urban planning, and social ecological systems. So you can see why I was interested in inviting her here today, and also why she'd be an interesting speaker for us. So I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Hoover, and thank you again for joining us.
We need to turn off.
Thank you so much. So I am just going to get my presentation up and running. And it looks like you all can see the main title slide. I won't be able to see the chat. So if there are any questions that come through, I will be able to get to those at the end of my presentation. And I will probably defer to one of my hosts to monitor that in case there's any audio or visual problems during the presentation. Yes, so I'm joining you all virtually, and thank you so much for hosting me today. And today I'm going to be talking about some of my most recent work, which I've titled Dissecting the Decision-Making Process of Green Infrastructure Siting. And so just to give you an overview of the talk, I'll be speaking for about 45 minutes and then leaving time at the end for questions. And I like to start my talk with a series of affirmations before getting into some basic background information on green infrastructure and the way that I think about it and approach it from a research perspective. And then also moving into the nitty-gritty of my project that I've been carrying since this past postdoc prior to coming to the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. So to start, I want to affirm that all Black lives matter. I also want to affirm that disability rights are human rights. I think both of these things are integrated as well, right? We can't necessarily distinguish all of these components, but in particular from the past year, both with all of the protests for the right to live and to thrive, as well as protests against police brutality, it being the 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act having passed as well last year. There's a lot of different things that I think we've seen both nationally and globally of citizens and residents really fighting for their continued civil rights and maintaining those civil rights. And with that, I think being that we are in a STEM space, it's important to also affirm the value of respecting Indigenous sovereignty and knowledge, particularly when we think about the ways that our methods or practices or even the places that we teach or work are often unceded lands of Indigenous tribal communities, and the value and information that they have gifted to many of us in our practice as scientists and thinking about how we connect to ecological spaces and other spaces. This really connects to the last affirmation, which is that science is not objective, right? Even though we have a scientific method, that starts from a point of observations. And what you observe is very much influenced by who you are and the environment in which you grow up in. And so this is how I position myself as a researcher, as an interdisciplinary scientist and scholar activist. And so I think it's important to share that with all of you. Okay, so in terms of urban planning and green infrastructure, it really starts from, the early 2000s in the United States, where we see both in terms of research and literature, as well as governments or other nonprofits, both adopting this term and starting to implement these practices. And one of the things that's so interesting about this term overall is that it can actually be very ambiguous. And so a recent study that is currently, it's actually been accepted, but they don't have a DOI yet. They looked at several different plans from across the United States and how cities were defining green infrastructure. And they identified over 153 unique definitions. And within this definition, stormwater and hydrologic purposes and uses for green infrastructure, or GI, as I will refer to it throughout the rest of the presentation, certainly dominates that conversation and the way it is defined. But then they also identified these three different types of GI, which include both materials as well as technologies and vegetation. And the picture on the right here is actually a bioretention system in Washington, D.C. And you can see all three of those types present, right? So we've got forms of vegetation present in the bushes and tree. And then we also have pervious pavers that are alongside this retention system, right? And so that is combining a specific type of material and technology. And then we have the drainage system itself and the curb cut to allow stormwater to move into that particular GI practice. And so then when we think about green infrastructure and stormwater in particular, not just because it is such a dominant part of how cities define this term, but also because it's something that has been really codified, particularly within the United States, both at a agency level. So if we think about the definition that the Environmental Protection Agency provides us of green infrastructure, as well as the ways that it has showed up in more recent legislation through Congress, both in terms of the Clean Water Act or the Green Infrastructure Plan that was introduced and failed, but even most recently, the large infrastructure plan as well. And so, again and again, we see the strengthening of the relationship and defining of GI against, with, for stormwater purposes. And I just wanted to provide the definition that the EPA uses that was also then used within those specific congressional bills as well. And so we can see in this definition that they specifically talk about GI as a purpose, a technique, a use for natural systems to mimic in some way the infiltration, evaporation, or storage of stormwater, right? And that it is also in some way preserving or enhancing the natural hydrology of the ecosystem around it, as well as restoring and improving water quality. And so then when we think about how this moves into urban ecological spaces and urban planning, we really see this come through ecosystem services, which in this case are benefits that people receive from nature, whether directly or indirectly. And I've provided an example of what a direct service might be versus an indirect service, right? And so this language of ecosystem services and also its connection to green infrastructure and planning comes out of the Millennial Ecosystem Assessment, which created these 4 different categories of ecosystem service identification. And they're listed here. And this is important because particularly from a planning perspective and how GI is integrated into urban landscapes, oftentimes ecosystem services become a big part of the conversation around that, both from a justification or a rationale perspective, as well as from a planning and siting perspective. And typically, if any of you are engineers in the room, right, sometimes this is often seen more commonly or is more perhaps legible as some form of economic valuation of the environment, right? And so we also see this in terms of efforts to monetize a particular type of ecosystem service, as well as looking at different benefit cost analyses, willingness to pay models, rank preference models, other attempts to try and determine how do we create or assess the value of this particular service that will be attached to this particular green infrastructure practice. And so the other important component of my work and how I think about green infrastructure is the way that it's placed in context. And it's really important to think of green infrastructure, right, as and its predecessor, green space. And thinking about green space in the context of urban planning as a whole system, right? And so green space is across the United States a reflection of the racial segregation and concentrated wealth tactics that were often and still integrated into planning, design, and implementation across US cities. And so with demographic changes and displacement over time, we can now examine the effects of green space and how it's visually represented across our landscape. And so I put together this 3-city panel representing different geographic regions. And so in the first image on the left, we have Los Angeles. And here we actually see legacy effects of privatized green space policies that commonly privileged wealthier LA residents. And this is demonstrated at the transition space that I've highlighted by this red box. And so we can see to the left, we have not just also some elevation there, we see a little bit of small hill mountain range, but also just more green space in general, right? And that's very much connected to the history of the city, where the city may install a particular green space, whether that is, landscaping in the more traditional sense, or even street trees. But then it was the responsibility of the residents or the property owner to maintain it, both in terms of, pest control, watering, any other pruning that might be needed, or fertilizing, all of which costs money. And particularly in a region that is more semi-arid, resources like water become much more expensive, right? And so we see the legacy of that now, in that most of the areas where you have a higher concentration of green space, you typically have more historic resources of wealth. And then we can move to the center in an image, right? Baltimore, Maryland, very, very close by. And here we see the way that racial segregation in particular has played out along something known as redlining, which has created these predominantly white neighborhoods that have very lush green spaces, right? And you can see this, this kind of transition piece of north of the box. We see a much denser, more lush green vegetation. We also see more, curving streets. If we think of kind of those meandering pathways that are more characteristic of suburban life. And then south of that, right, we see a much more traditional grid system that we're familiar with on the Mid-Atlantic, much less green space, right? And oftentimes within Baltimore and still, the spaces that are more green are predominantly white and wealthy, while the less green spaces are predominantly Black and brown. And there's been a lot of research coming out of the Baltimore Long-Term Ecological Research Site as well, talking about the legacies of redlining and housing segregation and how that connects to green space. So then in the final image, we have St. Louis, Missouri, which while also is a very heavily segregated city, in this case, this is an image from the northern part of the city, which is predominantly Black. But what we notice is that a lot of the green spaces present in this image are actually due to a high number of vacant lots within the city, right? And this is both in part because of St. Louis's vacant demolition program, where they come in and take down, demolish homes that have been abandoned or foreclosed on, and infill them and leave that lot empty, right? Or repurpose it for some type of green infrastructure stormwater practice. And so really what this is here to illustrate is the way that there are similarities across all of these cities. But ultimately, we see the way that racism has driven a lot of the shaping of urban green space across these different types of climate zones, populations, demographics, right? And so for me in my work, one of the things that I'm really interested in is exploring how those drivers that led to the way we see current green space distributed connects to green infrastructure, and how that carries over to the planning processes of green infrastructure itself, particularly when there is a lack of intentional design or inclusion of environmental justice or equity within those processes. And so that really leads me to the focus of my project and talk for today, which is this question of, is GI a universal good? And I want to acknowledge my other collaborators who have been both working on this project as well, asking similar questions. And so, for their work and the Carey Institute, I'm both very grateful and want to recognize the hard effort that they have put into both collecting the documents that I'll be discussing today, as well as the collaboration. And so for this work, I wanted to share some of my original guiding research questions. And this really came out of this kind of multi-pronged recognition that oftentimes when cities are talking about the benefits of GI, they are strongly mentioning different ecosystem services, right? They're talking about the multifunctionality of GI and all the different ways that it can achieve both cultural services or things like well-being or health, social cohesion, as well as water quality or stormwater management or runoff reduction. But alongside that, there's often a lack of kind of explicit or clear steps as to how they are actually achieving this multifunctionality, or whether or not they are using metrics and information to monitor or evaluate the kind of actualization of these benefits of GI. And so within that, the question that I ultimately had in questions were really trying to determine how are cities identifying where they're locating new green infrastructure practices, and in particular, what is the criteria that they're using to do that? And so from that, we decided to look at the city plans, right? As those are typically the baseline for any city vision or potential funding lines and efforts, and where projects are going to be prioritized or deprioritized. And so this database is comprised of now over 120 city planning documents across 20 US cities. And you can see that they span, again, right, different climatic zones, different city sizes, different demographics of those cities, to really try to capture the different ways that cities may approach green infrastructure planning, and in what ways there may be more relevance of certain services or criteria to one city over the other based on those needs. And so within that, we used a mixed methods approach. And for those that may be unfamiliar with more qualitative or quantitative research methods of the social sciences, codes in this case are categories that we use to group different themes for the stated citing criteria and rationale within these plans. So first we started with keyword searches for green infrastructure. And we had an initial set of assumed codes based on prior work and experience with GI planning research. So things like, economic or cost benefit, stormwater, things that we were kind of expecting to see green infrastructure being mentioned in connection to. And then as we reviewed the codes and continued reading, we added and modified these categories to reflect broader or more detailed themes that we found reoccurring within the documents. And so then finally, once we have gone through all of the documents, we come up with a final set of codes and content where then we look for patterns across these categories and eventually across the cities themselves. And so just to give you an idea of what that looks like, one of the initial code categories we had was cost, right? Certainly that will be a relevant criteria that's mentioned within these plans. And so then that expanded to include cost that related to property value, types of cost services or cost effectiveness, available funding and budget, etc. Right? And so through the process of reiterative coding, we then broke out cost to reflect the specificity that we saw happening within these plans. And so moving forward, as I present the results of this work, I just wanted to explain the different system that we have. So we started with the largest categorization or aggregation of these codes, which are groups, and then they're broken into categories and subcategories. So as an example, cost would be a category, and cost effectiveness would be the subcategory. And within that, we have a total of 7 thematic groups. And so these include quite a bit, and I won't get into detail on all of these groups due to time. But I did want to provide the full list so that you could see both the definitions for these groups. So if we use the cost example again, its thematic group was economic, right? So that included any type of cost related or economic business or land development efforts or criteria that were mentioned. And so this is a summary of the distribution of all the citing criteria by their category and subcategory with the large thematic groups on the x-axis. And so you can see from this that, unsurprisingly, right, hydrology is the largest thematic group. And within hydrology, stormwater was one of the largest citing categories that was mentioned across the plans in these cities. Logistics is followed up next. And this was a theme that arose from the plans themselves. And in particular, both the terms feasibility and leveraged opportunities were codes that came out of the plans based on the language that was being used repetitively across the different cities. And then we have our social category, which included things like community well-being and health, as well as environmental justice, which I've highlighted here to see how it compares in terms of the quantity or frequency. And so for the details, I'm going to focus on these first 3 thematic groups, in part because they are the largest, and I also want to discuss some of the distinctions across them. And then More specifically, I will be focusing on both the community category, stormwater, and feasibility categories. And so this is the breakdown of the stormwater category. And so within this, you can see that the storm and sewer or runoff and flooding were some of the predominant ways that cities were citing green infrastructure, meaning that when cities mentioned how they were going to locate green infrastructure or decide where it would go, most often they referenced some perhaps model or effort to identify areas where they needed to reduce runoff, whether because it was associated with the combined sewer system or efforts to reduce flooding in a particular area, or based on location or proximity to a storm sewer outlet, for example. And so thinking about, both the connections from green space and the way that those planning processes have shaped the implementation of those practices and what that may mean for green infrastructure, there's a couple things that I identified as part of this relationship. And so, as I mentioned, stormwater is still the primary driver based on the plans, right? And a lot of this comes both from how cities are managing their built environment and how they're planning GI based on sewer type or flooding, or even something like imperviousness or using a SWOT model or some other type of HEC-HMS watershed computer modeling program, right? And so in some ways, this may inadvertently benefit lower income or minoritized neighborhoods and communities of color, right? Because if we think about the relationship between elevation and housing segregation, oftentimes lower elevation or areas that were overlapping with floodplains were typically where we see lower income people of color being restricted to living and housing. And so in that way, prioritizing hydrologic metrics like where is the floodplains, right? Where is it more likely to flood based on elevation could mean that GI may be placed there more frequently. And on the other hand, one of the things that is kind of the flip side of that, right? Particularly if we think back to that example of St. Louis, where there is not a lack of green space per se, right? Vacant or otherwise, are the risks that the GI and a stormwater driven focus may conflict with other neighborhood or community needs or preferences, right? So if we think about St. Louis, where they're a city that has high vacancy rates, as well as high existing green space. This is also true on south and west sides of Chicago. Old growth trees, right? Much more yard space. GI may not be the most appropriate practice in terms of managing stormwater flooding or other forms of stormwater related problems, right? And so then the downside becomes that this seemingly objective analysis and approach of relying on floodplain identification or elevation or your modeling tool may inadvertently continue to oppress whatever needs and preferences those communities may have. So then if we move into feasibility, which was a category under that logistics, the thematic group, we see that ownership was one of the largest subcategories within that, followed by things like field or site observations, spatial constraints, or availability. And I have the definitions on the right side as well, right? And so ownership simply referred to whether it was land owned by the city or not. And so in the same vein as the stormwater category, I will move through these other categories, thinking about possible equity or inequitable implications. And so this is an example of a quote from one of the plans that was specifically looking at both public private property and leveraged opportunities, where they say GI will be prioritized or given preference to areas with existing GI projects and the potential for economic development. And so one of the things that was really interesting about this particular piece and element is that it, in a lot of ways, even further limited participation and involvement of residents, in part because you have a combination of areas being preferenced that are already publicly owned, meaning, you know, lands owned by the city. So there is less of an effort to involve or go out and practice different outreach methods with private property owners and residents or resident groups. And then the other downside is that this also prioritized existing projects in order for GI to go with them. So typically what happened, or at least the pattern we saw with the plans, is that often things like a new resurfacing project within the Department of Transportation, for example, would be prioritized or given higher preference for having a GI project added onto that because it was already planned, because the constraints had already been identified, right? Perhaps the permits had already been acquired. And so a lot of it related to these more kind of engineering related step-by-step processes of how things happen across the landscape and the order in which they have to happen in order to see something realized. And so, you know, as part of that, right, you have the potential of excluding communities, particularly if they aren't already included in any of the capital planning or comprehensive plans that are existing. You also, because often these cities lacked a specific funding base solely for green infrastructure. So typically this was done because it was cheaper to add a tree trench or a rain garden to something that was already, you know, pretty much paid for, opposed to having to pay for not just the rain garden, but then any type of street resurfacing or, you know, hourly workers, all of the other components that go into managing the cost of any type of infrastructure investment. And so then you have to make sure that, or really you're relying or assuming that your prior projects and processes are going to be just and equitable if you are attaching GI to those projects. And we know from experience, from practice, from research that, you know, for the most part, this isn't true. Typically, minoritized communities, right, are in part also minoritized because they have reduced infrastructure investment, both present and historic. And so unless those things are changing based on how GI is functioning within this feasibility category, and this idea of leveraged opportunities as well, it's unlikely that relying on something like cost sharing, well, we'll get to cost sharing in a minute, but relying on something like, you know, whether there's a spatial constraint or a project already planned isn't going to yield the level of environmental justice that I think many cities are expecting. And so I wanted to focus on the community category, which was the largest category in the social theme, right? And if you remember, the social thematic group was the third largest. And so one of the things that I found really interesting was once we started taking a closer look at some of the specific codes and the ways that the plans were referencing or defining what outreach looked like, what education looked like, what recreation looked like, right? We see that it's not quite the same as what I may think of it, or another social scientist or community engaged researcher may define the terms. And so within the outreach subcategory, a lot of that pertained to relying on like 311 calls that had come in, reports of flooding complaints from residents, as well as any type of prior engagement with that community or neighborhood from the city. So maybe involvement from a prior city-run or financed program. The education subcategory was this weird space of prioritizing green infrastructure on or near school property, in part because it was an effort to both identify publicly owned lands. And so the Board of Education is a public entity, and therefore their lands are easier to implement green infrastructure on, as well as some elements of being able to put it at a school where you will have children coming through every day, and potentially engaging with that practice and learning more about it. And so, you know, there's certainly a range of whether those elements were actually mentioned as part of the identification of school property. So oftentimes an effort to actually educate or help engage the students or the people that may be coming to the school wasn't actually mentioned. And whether we're left to kind of assume that that is the intention or not, I think can have potential implications one way or the other. And so in terms of thinking about, you know, what does this mean from an environmental justice perspective and thinking about equity is really the different ways that their outreach is limiting, right? And so for one, we really have this passive engagement that the city is, or multiple cities are using in order to connect to the communities and outreach, right? So as I mentioned, right, relying on things like prior complaints or 311 calls, prior participation or engagement with the city in some way is really going to only get and capture individuals or neighborhoods that are already active, right? And in particular, one thing that I found interesting was often, you know, there was a lack of explicitly stating specific neighborhoods or communities to outreach to. Excuse me. And so within that, right, I think there's a recognition from my part and my work that often residents who are minoritized are less likely going to participate in these processes. Excuse me. And so that may be because they're disenfranchised. That may be because they've been excluded from prior processes. But ultimately, we know that time, money, knowledge, and empowerment, right? And a belief that your engagement is going to matter or going to actually change is important in order to participate at any level of outreach. And so I wanted to provide an example of a quote from one of the plans for what a prior engagement looked like, and in particular how this showed up in the text. So in this example, it says the community is participating. Actually, maybe I'll let you all read it while I drink some water and get this itch out of my throat. Okay, hopefully we're in the clear. So from this example, I share this because this is an example out of Philly, so also in the Mid-Atlantic, right? And they have this former initiative called the Model Neighborhoods. It's unclear what that is, right? We would have to go look at either a archived website or archived plan to understand who the neighborhoods were that participated in that. But that's what they're using as a starting point in order to identify possible partnerships, as well as overlapping that, right, from these flooding complaints and other water related issues. And so there's some information, but there's not the level of detail to be able to fully understand and know whether or not the individuals and neighborhoods that were part of this initiative are also minoritized or also in need of green infrastructure practices in particular. So then lastly, I wanted to also highlight the specific environmental justice criteria that did show up in the plans. So when I was reading through the plans, noticed that environmental justice came up in 3 ways. So the first was often and unsurprisingly related to some type of distributional element. And this is a quoted example from one of the plans to illustrate what that meant, right? So thinking about where are the things, where can we put GI, where GI may not already exist, where green space may not exist, right? And having that be based on some type of demographic information or neighborhood, or even thinking about the subshed or sewer shed scale of a city. The second way environmental justice criteria showed up was in reference to some type of institutional process, whether that be justice or an unjust process. So this is one example that all the plan said was areas with historical and current underinvestment. And then lastly, the third way, which was the most specific example, was to identify some form of at-risk or highly vulnerable neighborhood. And so in this case, this plan specifically says, you know, addressing the impacts of climate change on communities of color and low-income communities. That still does not tell us within that particular city, right, what those communities are, where they are, neighborhood names. And so this gives you an idea of kind of the level or length to which most of the plans got as specific as they were going to get in terms of directly talking about environmental justice and green infrastructure in conjunction with one another. And so I did want to show you all how the themes and the categories broke out across city, because this is also really helpful information. Because as I mentioned, right, there's different population, demographic sizes, and of course, different climatic zones across all of these different cities. And so if there's a blank space, that means that there was no criteria codes identified for that section for that city. So one of the things that was most striking to me is that the only thematic group that was consistent across all cities was this economic thematic group. And so that group in particular, one of the largest categories was cost. And you can see in this example that cost services, effectiveness, sharing and analysis made up the largest or most common way that green infrastructure was cited and identified within these projects, right? And so in even though the thematic group is fourth in terms of the frequency of citing criteria, I think that this is one that is really important to talk about because it does have such strong implications of where these practices are actually going to go. And in particular, one of the concerns that I've identified is the ambiguity of something like cost effectiveness, right, and cost sharing, because it was used across all of the cities. And while some cities described it as being within a defined budget, prioritizing projects that had a cost sharing element, benefit cost analysis, et cetera, the majority of cities did not provide any type of definition or clarification on what that meant. And so, in fact, I have an example. This is one city's response in a call for public comments, which was part of the plan, that really summarizes this ambiguity and lack of definition, right? And so the public comment was asking for a definition of cost effectiveness because it's how GI was going to be prioritized. And they say that there is no single definition or criterion that the city can use, and that everything will be considered, on an individual by individual basis. And so certainly from thinking about GI planning, and in particular the context of environmental justice, this raises a concern because it's very unclear what it means. And this term can also really be subjective, right? And so what is considered cost effectiveness changes based on the politics of the city, based on the neighborhood, the race of the people that are living in that neighborhood. And in a recent talk last year on developing spaces of inclusion, Paige Glotzer, who's a professor at UW-Madison and also has a book out now, has highlighted the very close relationship between land investment and anti-Black racism. And Andrew Perry, who also has a book out on valuing Black space and Black land and pricing, talks about this as well, and the way that segregation is a form of profit, and how the valuing of spaces, physical spaces and home values is racialized, right? It's a racialized process. And so I think this also can extend to this idea of cost effectiveness and how we determine green infrastructure placement as part of it. And so I wanted to leave you with a couple quotes that I think both continue to really guide my work and help me really think about GI in the context of both this criteria and its predecessor green space, right? And so one of the things that we see coming through these plans is this strong kind of economic, technical or feasibility metrics and ways of talking about green infrastructure and figuring out where it's going to go, right? And how that can really undermine, as Horwood states in this quote, right? Undermine the alternative ways in which communities express their values and needs. And then a great quote also from Andrew Perry, he states that the value of assets are inextricably linked to the perceptions of Black people. And how much of the demand that impacts housing prices is affected by how people around it are perceived. And so there are many other scholars that talk about this. Carolyn Finney touches on this in many of her talks as well. But in closing, let me just put these all up for you. I think as I'm approaching green infrastructure and thinking about this base set of planning documents now, and the way that cities are identifying and talking about green infrastructure, these are some of the elements that I think I am really trying to move forward in my work to figure out what are these implications. And in particular, if we think about the foundation that is provided from, that the Horwood and Perry quotes, right? And the way that space and land are valued based on the people that are in them. What are our options? And what are some of the things that we need to do in order to make sure that ecosystem services that are being mentioned are accurately being evaluated or monitored and measured? What are some new models for evaluation that we can use that are going to better reflect both community need as well as stormwater needs, right? And maybe that is independent funding for GI. Maybe that is something that is detached from cost effectiveness or a benefit cost analysis. That is kind of the work and direction that I'm moving in now. And so with that, I will end because I want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions. And thank you all for listening. It's a lot of information. And then if you are on Instagram or Twitter, you can connect with me through there as well if you have to go and can't ask a question.
Yes, so we'd like to thank Dr. Hoover again for that really nice talk. And so I'm going to take some questions from the audience.
Thank you for your presentation. I mean, we have, I'm more familiar with ag BMPs and a little bit with urban stormwater management, green infrastructures. Cost sharing in some places actually for some levels of economic capability makes sense and it should be there. But the problem is that always, as you have pointed out, is profit in command, meaning that if it is just these green infrastructures are going to be based on cost share, then definitely those communities that have no financial capability, they're not going to have to be able to implement in those communities green infrastructures. So the action item for me really is that how we push the people that in the cities that are being elected from mayors, councils, and so forth as appropriate, that they should actually understand that point and not tie it to the capability of the financial capability of the communities. So I am a little bit, sort of scientifically we understand these and we do lots of research, but really politically there is not much pressure on politicians, in my opinion. So I'd like to hear your sort of, you have done extensive research, your view of that. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your question as well. Yeah, so I think this is why I ground my work in thinking about environmental justice, because for me it is approached both from the research scholarship as well as the activism and the community in organizing, right? And so, ultimately, I think if we are going to move elected officials and folks that are in those more powerful decision-making roles, it has to come through public demand. And so whether that be working with local nonprofits or environmental justice activist groups and connecting with the particular missions or projects that they're engaged in to push that to be introduced by the local city or state representative. I think that's where that particular type of work has to be done, because I ultimately don't know how well politicians or elected officials will really fold in researchers as part of their policy planning. I think there's some room for that depending on the level. And I do think that at the local level, you can get that a bit more than at the federal level, where I think it's a bit more challenging. But yeah, I think ultimately that's where organizing comes in and fills the gap that research isn't able to reach. And yes, and so that's where I would say I think is where the efforts need to go. Because I don't know that the argument for the cost, right? If we think about kind of climate change impacts and the costs associated with climate change based migration, climate refugees, or flooding insurance claims, things like that. I don't know that that argument is necessarily working at the level that we need it to in order to see more rapid change. And so yes, activism is where I recommend the energy go.
Thank you. Are there other questions from the audience?
I put my question in the chat box, but it builds on the previous question. I guess just more broadly, how do we advance implementing green infrastructure in areas that are underserved and really improve our ability in environmental justice through the green infrastructure, just more broadly than politics?
Yeah, so I think I do think that there needs to be some decoupling of green infrastructure, both decoupling from stormwater management and as a specific stormwater tool, as well as from environmental justice. I think green infrastructure is a tool, just like many of the other things that we have. That includes gray infrastructure. And so I think in order for us to really think about, implementing something like environmental justice across these planning practices, it has to start with a community need level. And what is it that the residents are asking for or demanding? What is it that they need? Does green infrastructure align with any of those things? And if it doesn't, being comfortable letting it go, because in the case of St. Louis, right, the residents have said, we don't want green infrastructure. We would like the gray infrastructure. And the gray infrastructure is what's been used on the south side of St. Louis, right? And green infrastructure is the less expensive stormwater tool in particular, if we're comparing green versus gray. And so I think we have to be really conscious about, are we using green infrastructure because it's the best thing for the community, or are we using it just because it's the cheapest thing, and therefore repeating patterns of inequitable disinvestment, and using green infrastructure as a way to kind of, assuage any feelings of guilt that would otherwise be present. And so, yeah, I think we need to let go of GI as being this thing that can do all of these multifunctional, services, functions, and just let it stand alone as something that may or may not work, right? But starting at the level of, well, what does this community need in the first place? And if there's an alignment, great. If not, let's look for something else that will work.
Thank you. Other questions from the audience? Question online? I think we have one more.
Peter asked a question. There was one question on the chat. Did you see that, Dr. Hoover? I think Peter asked another question.
Not really a question, but I like, as far as funding for green infrastructure, I really love the Chesapeake Bay Trust model with their bay plates, funding outreach and small community-based green infrastructure implementation projects. But that's a unique model and isn't really nationwide. But I like your question. And first of all, great presentation and research. I really enjoyed it a lot. But I also, I liked your question about, because some people think of green infrastructure as solving all these problems. But I've worked in some communities where that's been a real question of whether green infrastructure should be, whether you even want it in your community, because it's for some folks a signal that of gentrification or things of that nature. Planting more trees means now we're going to get forced out of our neighborhoods, along the streets. And so that's an interesting question there too as well. And I wonder if you have run into any of that with your research of kind of that backlash to green infrastructure, which you just touched on briefly a minute ago, and how to maybe overcome that.
And I just want to interject and say real quick, we probably have enough time to maybe like a 30-second reply to that.
Great. Yeah, so I think when I was doing my interviewing in Chicago, one of the components of the interview was to have residents rank different types of practices, right? And by far, many of the residents, particularly if they were older, at least at the very least, definitely homeowners, right, did not want trees, because they had plenty of them, or they had, taken them down, or they didn't like them because the roots would break into their water and pipe system, right? And so certainly I've encountered folks who are amenable to more of a garden type practice, opposed to something that they see, resulting in more maintenance or more cost because of something else that's going to happen in 10, 15 years when that practice is still present. And so I think that, those are absolutely both things I've observed and things I think that you have to ultimately just talk to the residents and talk to the people in the area that you're trying to implement these practices to figure out what is preferred. And if they don't want that particular thing, right, what are the reasons behind it? And then what are the alternatives?
Great, thank you. So I think we should probably stop there because we're out of time. But Fushcia, I want to thank you. This was a great talk. Thank you for answering all our questions.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.